Hello, Marvels. Welcome to today's episode, or a group of recovering vacuum addicts.
Yes, we're going to talk about identity, and Gwen and I share an identity piece of vacuuming addicts together, and it's deep-seated. It definitely goes back to childhood. I can remember my dad doing it and thinking, what is the deal with that? What's your problem? And then as an adult, I'm like, oh, I do it. And I, German Austrian roots. I'm like, it's like part of my DNA.
Vacuuming?
Just order and keeping things clean.
Order. Yeah. Similar. I mean, I come from and I will say my parents growing up were very tidy people. And not that we had a ton because we were immigrants from Malaysia in, Calgary, Alberta. And so they're very tidy people. But I was tasked with doing a lot of chores very early on. Like I remember pushing a gas starting lawnmower up a hill, and I might have been 6.
Oh, I believe that. Yeah. I was folding laundry by 4 at the latest. Yeah. Putting
and it was
away.
like that or be beat. Like that, those were the options, like, and the beating was like, and I remember very early on, my mom listens to this podcast. So mom, take this with a grain of salt.
Oh no.
But and it wasn't her actually that did this, but I had gone to kindergarten, right? This was my first exposure to the Western, to kind of the Western way. And they told us in class, they said, if your parents hit you or they yell at you, this is what I remember as a kindergartner. Yeah. And I started kindergarten when I was 4. Okay. I don't think my parents knew what to do. So I was very young, but I remember this very clearly from Mrs. Appleby's class. If your parents do that, you can tell us at school, we'll call the police. And I remember thinking, hallelujah. Like, what? Like, oh my God, this is bad. This is not, it always felt wrong to me. Not that I was beat, but I mean, there were certain expectations in my household. And I, my grandmother being, a very old school kind of matriarch in my family, had no problems with like knocking us on the head. Right.
Yeah.
And I came home and I said to my dad, you can't, I just found out at school, you cannot hit me or yell at me.
Yeah.
And, because the police are going to get called. And you know what he said to me?
Oh, God. Go ahead and call the police.
He said, I will give you something to call them about if you're going to do it. And I was like, I'm out. Bye. Like, like I was like this little, but I have this like real memory of that. It's just so funny.
I was clearly in a different generation because I didn't learn that in kindergarten. I learned if you get hit, you were doing something wrong and you were a bad kid. And you must have done something to deserve it.
It must have been you. It must have been you.
Stop doing that.
Oh my God. Well, we also did learn about bear prevention, like what to do when you run across a bear.
So that you grew up in Calgary.
Because I grew up in Calgary.
Yeah. Oh my God.
Yeah. Here it's earthquakes. There I don't think they do that anymore. Wow. But isn't that funny?
We do talk about though. We were talking about before we came on. Yeah. About we were talking about identity, and as those of you who have followed us for a while know, we go on wonderfully fruitful tangents and we always come back, but this sense of like the fishbowl you're in really does affect you, right? And so we've talked about, especially like with complex trauma, things that happen and how they get framed growing up, we know is under the umbrella of neurodiversity. And those things, trauma, like PTSD, if you're talking about someone who's in like a wartime situation, assuming they don't have childhood trauma, that PTSD they're coping with and they're being exposed to it as a fully formed adult. Not that that's not extremely significant, that post-traumatic stress that develops. Yeah. But it's different than complex trauma that starts when you're still developing. So in essence, those things become part of who you are. So like that thing, like, oh, I was told I could call the police on you, and your dad's like, oh, you want to bet? And then you run away. I remember how fast I had to get out of my chair to run up this. We had like a semicircular stairs going up to my room. How fast I had to get up and run up the stairs to outrun my dad into my room to shut the door before he got to me. I knew how fast to do. And I tell people that I think it's hilarious, right? So back then, because we were all in the same pond, you'd share that with my friend Shireen. She's like, ha, yeah, I know how to do that too. If you were to say that to like a 23-year-old now, they would look at you. Yeah. What is wrong with you? Why are you laughing about that? So some of it is like it was normal for us, but it doesn't mean it didn't leave marks, right?
Yeah.
And so those identity pieces you're having to deal with now, they're still there. So you may have to unpack them, and they may be somewhat surprising to you. You may have not even realized they were there. Not unlike if you get diagnosed as neurodivergent, especially later in life, you're like, what do I do with this? Yeah. How do I unpack this? How does this have to do with my identity when I didn't even know it was there?
Yeah. And that identity, if we think about identity as the collection of symbols, usually for us it's language, we would use to describe ourselves, maybe our values, or I grew up thinking, and I didn't really understand this until really graduate school for me, because, that's when we're really talking about identity formation. But like our identity naturally shifts and evolves over time.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And, as a young child, it's like, no, that's my identity. Full stop. Yeah. Concrete. Yeah. That's it.
Right.
And another kind of revolving theme for us is really trying to get away from those kind of thought traps, those rigid thought traps, right? Yeah. Because they lead to nothing but suffering.
That's right. And self-flagellation and shame and all the bad stuff that we've talked about.
All the bad S words. Yeah. And I think that in my experience as a therapist or a psychologist who's supporting, especially young adults who are just coming to their diagnoses, right? Mm-hmm. Whether it's, autism or ADHD, or they're falling under the neurodivergent kind of category here. There is this kind of rocking of their worlds a little bit.
Well, that kind of rocking. Yeah. If you think about like when you get any identity piece all at once, I think about the analogy of like medical things, like when someone finds out they have cancer, or earlier, like you're diabetic, and it's these things that massively interrupt your life course, but they're nevertheless there. You have to say, oh, I'm now a person who's had cancer, or I'm diabetic. To get something like that all at once, there is a huge adjustment period. We've had people ask questions on this. I've had people ask questions on my social media posts about what is the course that happens when you find out you are neurodivergent. And I'll say, well, first of all, it's different for everybody. But there are some of these predictable stages. There is, and it's sort of like the Kubler-Ross's stages of loss, right?
Of grief,
anger, denial, bargaining, depression, acceptance, and not necessarily in that order, right? Yeah. For me, I remember thinking, it was sort of like the last episode when I first got my period. I'm like, I don't want anybody to know. I was freaked out. I'm like, and hid it and didn't tell anybody for a number of years. And then finally just told my wife, and she's like, yeah, duh, that makes perfect sense. And I'm like, really? So the sense of, oh my God, who am I now? And fear, right? The sense of shame around it, fear around it. And part of that, I think, is totally understandable. It's the fear of the unknown. And so for me, to keep it inside and doing secret research for 6 years on it, like, oh, okay, that could be me. That could be every test I take is showing that I'm autistic, but learning. I needed to have those pieces settled in me first before I let them be to the outside world. And knowing that is not the typical way that happens. A lot of times people go, most of the time I would say people go into someone like us, or they find out that they are, and then what do I do? So you get smacked. It's like hitting a brick wall all at once. And again, it goes back to that information seeking. Anything you're feeling is valid, whether it's relief. I hear that a lot from people. They're like, oh, I finally understand what's happening. I finally understand myself. And then there's this period of like the angels singing and I want to tell everybody. And then there's this rubber band effect of, oh my God, I'm ashamed of it. And what does this mean? the marginalizing pieces. Is this really who I am? They haven't sort of settled into the other identity pieces yet. And you have this period of freak out, like, oh my God, I told too many people. It's too out there. I can't control it. Now what? There's also can be a layer of mourning and grief around it. Like, what is this? Does this mean I'm not, I went through a lot of I'm not normal, or I'm not like other people, or I have these struggles now that I'm actually owning. And now it's more, feels like there's more, like you said, suffering, right?
Yeah.
That eventually turned into, wait a minute, then I can do something about it and actually live better. But you sort of have to go through that period of like, wow, this sucks. You know,
Yeah.
I'm mourning the idealized self or able to self that I thought I was, and now I'm not. And I'm running into all these limits, and I don't like it, and I have all this loss and everything that comes with that. And again, these are not necessarily in order. They're different, and they're not like once you get through one stage, it's over. It continues to go in layers, right? And then maybe again, pulling out of that and saying, oh, I'm empowering myself now, and this is who I am, and this helps explain who I am, and I'm not apologetic about it. And then you're in just the right situation. You're like, oh my God, I'm ashamed of myself again. It's going to keep, that pendulum is going to keep swinging. But those are all normal phases to go through. And I think it's because it's so identity based. It's not like, oh, I'm a blonde now. Look, I bleached my hair. I'm a blonde now. Oh, it's so fun to be in the world as a blonde. You could say that you may have some identity pieces in being a blonde, but it's very different than this is fundamentally who I am, how I see the world, how all information gets into my body and my brain, and how all information comes out of my body and my brain. It's everything, right? And boom, it's all at once. And so it makes sense that however many years you didn't know, you're having to spend all those years reintegrating that. It would be just like any other therapy. You know, I do this a lot with complex trauma folks that I work with, because I've worked with trauma for 30 years. It's all these developmental pieces that we are trying to figure out. And what's really you? Was the you that went and stood up to your dad and said, I can call the cops? I could see an aspect of that being you, the Gwen that I've gotten to know. And then also the run away piece is also a part of who you are, right?
Totally.
So so we look at those and we're like, well, what is that? Can I have those at one time? I want to stand up for myself, but I also want to run away at the same time. And figuring out who you are, how it works, how it doesn't work, and how you want to live your life with those things. And that's a little bit of a long-term process. And, you know, you find out you're autistic after you're 30 and beyond. I think it's a multi-year process to work through all those layers for sure.
Yeah. And again, like, how often do we talk about the difficulty of change? That's a change, right? It's a change in the way that I might see myself, even though deep down I might have had this inkling or this feeling or this thing of like not feeling like I belong or this, right? And now it has a name. Again, too, we have done an episode on dialecticals or feeling multiple emotions at one time, sometimes opposing emotions at one time. And that's here, right? Like you can have some relief that you have a label for this and you're just not quote unquote making it up, or that you're lazy or unmotivated or you're not trying hard enough. You can find that relief there, but also be apprehensive about disclosure or what it means for you. So again, with this, being able to give yourself permission for evolution and change. Like I think about this as a mom, or like my identity as a woman having a child in my life, right? And the type of mom that I was when my kiddo was an infant, to her early childhood, to even now, my identity as a mom has really changed actually, because she's changing so dramatically that I've got to meet her where she is. I would have never, what I imagined the type of mother I would be, like when I thought about when she was little, and I would say, I'm going to be that ex-mom when she's a teenager. No. I'm just gonna, we're going to, and now that I'm here and I understand how she works the best, I just realized like, wow, I'm not in a position of control.
Yeah. Mhm. Yeah.
And it's just not that easy. And that you've got to let
Mhm.
your kids live their decisions, of course, within reason. But
True.
being able
Yeah.
to let go of some of those things is not the identity of a mother that I had 10 years ago,
Yeah. Oh,
even
sure.
15
Yeah.
years ago, or even as a professional. My
Yeah.
identity as a professional today is very different than my identity as a professional 10, 15,
Oh,
25 years
yeah.
ago,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So why not then the way in which we see ourselves and becoming more aware of the way we work? Like, I
Yeah.
think when you can open yourself up and look at yourself in a very curious and compassionate way, you
Mhm.
go,
Mhm.
"Oh, I do that."
Yeah.
I
Yeah, and I think it's different for everybody. I'm thinking of before I went on the air too, we've talked about, having difficulty. The writing process is very arduous and
Oh,
hard for both of us.
yeah.
Reading was always hard for me growing up for
Yeah.
lots of reasons and can still be
Yep.
kind of painful depending on what to read.
Yep.
Although I blazed right through the Harry Potter books, there was no problem.
Yep.
So there's other issues. But I'll normalize that now and talk about that with people. But I realize also my relationship with that part of me is easier now that I have a doctorate, right?
Wow.
Like before that, if I said, "Oh, I have a hard time reading and writing," "Oh, I'm dumb and I can't do it." And once I got the doctorate, I'm like, "Screw all of you. See, just because I couldn't write and read as fast as everybody else doesn't mean I'm not accomplished and can't do this thing." So that has given me permission to tell people and normalize and say, "I was terrible at reading and writing my entire academic career. It was painful, but I did it." Right? So those kinds of things can change the identity too. It's so weird. Yeah. Internalized shame, I'm
Yeah.
sure, is what helped that, right?
Yeah, and that's shame that it's kind of insidious. Like we don't
Mhm,
kind of, see it on our doorstep, but it's something that
mhm.
just seeps in through the cracks and through the cells over time as these kind
Right.
of, recurring messages because of our habitat or our ecosystem that we're
Yeah,
in.
yeah, yeah.
Um, but yes, like allow yourself to evolve, allow yourself to change the way in which you see yourself, and the way you might
Mhm,
describe yourself to others. And I think sometimes people don't sit and think about, like, life becomes very busy. And so
mhm.
there isn't this kind of moment where some self-reflection
Yeah,
can
that's
occur.
true.
And this is what therapy, I really feel like this is where, you know, therapy is
Mhm.
really an interesting component,
Yeah,
because it is a scheduled 50-minute
yeah,
focus spotlighting session, with a partner, with a partner here that keeps things curious and compassionate.
yeah, yeah.
Ideally, oh gosh, if
And
you're with a
focus to
therapist who
try
doesn't
to
do that,
identify
yikes.
what's going on, it's not that
Yeah.
you're just talking blah, 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 you're trying to get
Right.
to
How do you
something.
gain
Yeah.
insight? How do you gain
Mhm.
constructive insight from this, right?
That's right.
That's
Yeah.
really where I feel therapy shines. If you're
Yeah,
obviously with a good or the right therapist, right fit for
yeah.
you, you should really come out of that session going, "Huh,
Yeah, yeah, and even some
huh,
self-exploration, that was for me a lot of with looking at autism. There were some things I didn't relate to because a lot of it was about boys and men, but other things I was like, that explains why that," and that actually a lot of those things would let me let go of the shame. Of
yeah,
like, something wrong with me. Oh no, it's just this. I'm just wired differently, and that totally makes sense. Which fits with my Adlerian training. I mean, people say if you had to say what Adlerian training was in a sentence, I'd say it makes sense. You're constantly looking for what are you doing, how are you thinking, how are you living, and why does what you're doing make sense for you right now? And then it might not be
yeah."
adaptive, but of course it makes sense. That's why you're doing that, serving something. So
I
that's really nice to take away that stigma and that shame around it. Otherwise, you wouldn't be doing it.
Yeah.
Wasn't
I feel
helping.
like I
So
missed, like, the Adler boat. Like, I really feel like
oh,
I
yeah.
needed to be on that boat because I really function like
Yeah.
that very
Yeah.
naturally. And,
If you're not in an
you
Adlerian
know
program, you probably get like a 5-minute lecture on Adler and that's it. So
oh,
I had
that's it,
years of
okay.
it.
I don't
Yeah.
know, I'm just
Yeah.
like, between spitting in the soup and it making sense, I mean,
Yeah, there
it's
you go.
good.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
good stuff, it's good stuff.
Yeah.
If you haven't heard our spitting in the soup episode, you should go do that.
Yeah, check.
Oop,
Well,
I
the whole
said I should.
idea is
Oops.
it's not about just like Freud talked about just, it's neurosis and it has to be changed. And Adler really broke away from Freud because it's more complicated than that. And people are doing the best
Yeah.
they can. in the situation they're in, and let's look at why they're doing that. Why is the situation driving that? Totally makes sense, right? Doesn't mean you don't want to necessarily change it, but takes away that evaluative therapist role. Like, this is what you're doing wrong. Yeah, he was very much
that
about
judgment,
person-centered, try to meet them where they are. Yeah.
It's so
but he was also
so
somewhat disabled. He had a very disabled younger brother, and he was a Jew in the time of Nazi Germany. So there was a lot of reasons he was not privileged like Freud was. And so there were a lot of things that shaped even how he thought about things. And oppressive forces and forces that don't support people and so on, that sort of shaped how he saw people, right? Yeah. And that's in a way what therapy would try to have you do with yourself, and even getting used to or working through the parts of integrating neurodiversity into your neurodivergency into your identity is looking at all those things and just taking that stance of, how does this make sense for me? And then it won't feel so, oh my God, look how screwed up I am and look how many other things are wrong. But like, oh yeah, okay, that explains some things.
Yeah, it's almost like it feels like the pieces click into place.
Yeah, be less bumpy.
Like, yeah, and it's like you're not trying to fit that square peg in a round hole, and hammering it in, right? It's like, oh, wait a minute, like I'm more like, it's like more Lego based, like I just never, I was missing that like two by one connector that connects everything for whatever reason, whatever, like, how does that work and how does it make sense? That's a really lovely reframe. And that's something like I think anyone can do. It's a really easy thing when you feel judgment and criticism, self-criticism seeping in, rephrasing that to, wait, how does this make sense for me? Yeah. How does this make sense? Is a really lovely, very tangible kind of thing.
And even then you're gonna come up against it. When we were coming back from APA, I was exhausted, hadn't slept well. My, that ear ringy, tired. Yeah. We had to wait at the airport for a long time. I was walking around the shops and saw this little stuffed panda bear that I'd seen around DC because people get them like at the zoo. I'm like, I have to have that bloody panda bear. Yeah. So I bought the panda bear. And what I really wanted to do on the airplane was have it out and hold it, because I was just sort of feeling overwhelmed and just kind of wanted to hold it. And I didn't give myself permission. I had the, what are other people going to think, take the better of me, and kept it in the bag and put it in the overhead bin. And I did a TikTok video on it, and everybody was like, oh, but I shared that, not like, damn it, I should have done it the right way, but to really show how those struggles continue. And in hindsight, I'm like, oh, it would have been okay to hold the bear. And what I did, feeling a little bit overwhelmed by what other people would think, was okay too, right? Yeah. But knowing that struggle was there, and the old me wouldn't have even bought the bear. So, moving the right direction. Yeah. But I was worried, like, what are they going to think of this grown woman needing to hold this stuffy? And then I'm like, that'll be okay. So you'll continue to, and that's a sort of an innocuous example, but it goes deep. All those kinds of things you'll notice about yourself that you'll be trying to play with, that teetering of it. And it's all just part of it.
Right? Yeah. There's that impression management again, Dana.
Yeah, exactly.
But yeah, what do we say? Or I say this a lot in my practice: direction over speed. That if you move in the direction, the direction you imagine for yourself, but drop the speed, and I really feel like in the neurodiverse community, speed and load. How much, how fast, that is what gets people really hooked up, right? So really that becomes so overwhelming that you just stop trying. So
remember, exactly. Go back to that piece again. Don't give up. Speed. I love that though. Direction over speed. That's a good
direction over speed. Yeah. All right, you lovely Marvels. Thank you for being here. Thank you for being on our circuitous journey of identity
people that continue
evolution.
To listen to us like our tangents, or they wouldn't, I think, keep listening. So thank you for humoring us and aligning with the way our brains work. How's that?
It really, Dana and I are while we might have a unifying theme for the episode, we do allow ourselves to be very organic in the way in which we approach it. So we appreciate.
One of our followers has said he loves our banter, so I want to.
Yeah, really he does. Yeah. That. Yeah. And, when I was making all those mistakes with the editing, what happened on some of those episodes is our recording banter. Our pre-edited banter was there, which, by the way, is probably its own hilarity.
We could put a string of those together and just title it pre-recording banter. That would be hilarious.
Pre-recording banter. And I will tell you, and then after I fix the edit, you know, our community person, our listener said, "Oh, I kind of missed the pre-recording banter." Anyway,
we totally are gonna have to splice those together. That's too funny.
Oh my gosh! Well, you know how much bleeping and editing I'm going to have to do. I mean, Dana can be a fast slinger of the F word.
Yeah. Oh, I learned well from my mom, man. I know how to swear. That is for sure. God love her. I love that.
Oh God, love it. All right, everyone. We will see you in the next episode. Be good, be well. All right. Bye.
Bye, everybody.